think we're good. So we titled it The Memetic Code and Genetic Survival, and let me explain that. The Memetic Code is the code that's been applied to the Clare Graves model. And I'll explain more about Clare Graves later, but his model was probably the best one that's ever been developed in terms of identifying the various series of cognitive development that we experience here on this plane and in this reality. And of course, genetic survival, if we don't change our minds pretty soon, we're not going to survive as a species. And so it's pretty important for the survival. I mean, the planet will survive us. It will go on, but the survival of humans and perhaps the survival of vast swaths of other species are dependent on our getting things right. So I subtitled it How Cognitive Development Can Save Our Species and Our Planet. And I probably should move forward and just say a little something about myself before we explain what that means. So here's a little bit about me. I'm a scientist. My background is in psychology and economics and organizational development and behavior, which are all behavioral sciences, so they all fit together. But I'm also a mystic, and I came to mysticism relatively late in my life, but it seems to make the most sense to me of anything else I've ever studied. And I've studied religion since I was a kid, doing comparative religions and that kind of thing, because I just couldn't stand the church I was in, so I had to figure out what was going on. But I am both a scientist and a mystic, and you're going to see that mix in the discourse. I'm going to go to the third one, why I'm sitting. I put that in there because I wanted to, the first and the last meetings that we had to be in person. And on those in-person meetings, though, I wasn't going to be able to stand. So I'm sitting now because, of course, we're having a virtual meeting, but I am, and I promise not to, old people love to talk about their health, promise not to talk much about my health, but I've just discovered that I have a genetic disorder that has been trying to kill me for about 25 years. But it mimics all kinds of other diseases. So we've been trying to treat all these other diseases. And the kicker is the treatments for those diseases just makes this disease worse. And so we finally got it identified what's wrong with me. It's called ATTRCM. And I'm seeing a specialist in Denver who's one of the lead researchers in this area in the middle of April. And they've only known about the disease for 5 years, and they've only developed treatment for it in the last year. Up until now, you had to have a liver transplant and a heart transplant simultaneously. So, and I'm too old for either of those things. So the fact that they have a treatment now is making me pretty happy. But
in the beginning, and I had written my title and subtitle to include, or the description anyway, the description to include the fact that we'd be talking about the Graves technology. And recently Dorothy changed it to say that the spiral dynamics, and spiral dynamics is contained within the Graves technology. So we'll definitely be talking about spiral dynamics. We'll cover it from kind of soup to nuts, but we'll also be covering the larger picture of all of the people who have used Clare Graves' theory as a jumping off point, including myself. And this information is near and dear to my heart because when I was a much younger man, well, let's see, I was first introduced to the Graves material in the mid-'80s. And I think by that time he was already dead. But he was a professor emeritus at Union College in New York, and he had traveled the world studying this particular method of stage theory and human development. And of course, I'll give you a whole lot more about it. But there have been some primary people that have taken his information and then developed offshoots of their own. One of them was Don Beck and Chris Cowan, and I knew Don Beck, I knew Don and, I knew Don and Chris pretty well, especially Chris, and Chris is dead now, but they were the ones who developed the whole concept of spiral and the spiral dynamic. And early on, Don came to spend some time with my writing partner, partner Dudley Lynch and me to see if we would want to partner on the Graves stuff. Dudley was also one of the people who was developing the Graves material, and that didn't work out, but I got to know Don pretty well, and Don Beck was one of the first ones to apply Graves to social groups. So all of us were applying it to individuals up until that point, but he really saw the ability to apply it to social groups and cultures and nations and countries. So it was very important work. And later, as we talk about this, we'll talk about how important that is. And then Don went on eventually to work with Ken Wilber, and then Ken Wilber developed his own ideas around this and developed his own methods. And it's hard to pick up a book by Ken Wilber anymore and not see the Graves model inside, embedded within it. And then there have been many other people, and Dudley and I were two of the people who developed it simultaneously. And we used a numbering system. Claire used words, Don Beck used acronyms, and then they developed the spiral dynamics. And the reason they developed the spiral and the colors was because people became very frustrated with the idea of a hierarchy. At that time, hierarchy was a very bad word, and people saw it as being part of the dominant hierarchy, or people thinking they were better than somebody else or more advanced than somebody else. And so while Dudley and I were using 1 through 8, 9, 10, 11, they started using colors, and they put it into a spiral that better fit the facts at that time in terms of expanding worldview. So anyway, I'll show you some of the models that are out there right now. It's very diverse in how people talk about it, but it's all grounded in Clare Graves, and he really was the founder of the research and the ideas and the model that we all have used as starting blocks. Dudley and I wrote 2 books using the Graves model. The first one was called Strategy of the Dolphin. We published that in 1990. I think we wrote it in 1989. Went to William Morrow first, and then the paperback went to Random House, and then it went out in about 10 or 11 different languages around the world. It's very successful. We wrote a second book called Code of the Monarch because we wanted to further articulate System 8, and that did not do particularly well, and it didn't do particularly well because I would say a good 50 to 60% of the material was dead wrong. And so I point that out to show that as we start to get to the higher levels of cognitive and spiritual development, we don't have enough people on the planet to really study it. And so it becomes guesswork. And you'll see that as I start to show you some of these other models. So, okay, moving on. One of the things that's really important to me is simplicity. And I love this quote because I would not give a fig for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And hopefully that's what we'll do here. We'll take all of the various and sundry, complexities and different models and everything and bring them together into a very, very simple model that's easy to grasp and understand and apply. So I'm going to start off with one of the simplest things there is, and that is love is everything. And as we're talking about cognitive development, it can sound very cerebral and it can sound very complex, but ultimately we're moving toward this, and when we get here, we're going to arrive. So that's the end point. The end point is to get to where love is everything. And of course, Dorothy is at the forefront of that movement, helping everybody learn that love is where it's at, and that, the creator is love, and we're all created from love, and everything around us in love is love, and the best thing we can do is to get in harmony with that and to love better.
Somewhere in here. All right, so to keep it simple, I want to talk about the big picture because context is important. So how does this all fit together from the big picture, from the 500,000 foot view? So I want to talk about the great universal cosmic donut. Something is very, very near and dear to my soul, and also Homer Simpson's. And I love to use Homer because Homer is every man. I don't know if Marge is every woman, but Homer is certainly every man. So we have this great universal cosmic donut, and what I want you to think of it is, the model is God is in the center, the creator, the stillness, the source, the silence, the prime mover. Right in the middle of the donut is the creator. And then around the creator is the creation. And that kind of revolves in a toroidal shape, first beginning with the creator and then descending into the material world, and then eventually moving back up into consciousness and sentience, and then spiritual development and back to God. And that just seems to be how it works. from there, well, this is a little more of a graphic representation of how that is. So again, Homer's falling from this horse. He becomes inanimate matter, then he develops cognition, then sentience, and then of course develops his spiritual nature and eventually reconnects with all of us, with all of creation, with all of us, and with God in the totality. If we take a look at where science operates, remember I'm also a scientist, I know that many of you are as well, science really occupies about 1/4 of that circle. So when we go from inanimate matter to sentience, that's where science lives. And the Graves model is a scientific model. It's a scientific model that's been used to both study and categorize human behavior and human development for a very long time. And it comes from the social scientists. So it had some rigor attached to it, and it had some good experimental design and good analysis methods. So it passes all of the criteria for being acceptable within the scientific community. But it only covers just a small portion of what we as human beings experience. So we need to remember that the big circle is happening, and it is the superior context over the scientific context, which is why for me mysticism is so important. So when we're looking at science, and this is where science is really good at helping you fix your Chevy or figure out how cells divide or how stars move or whatever, but it's pretty rotten when it comes to the metaphysical aspects of reality. And science is part of our reality well that we've created collectively, which is very, very firmly anchored in the ego. And you can see it, and we'll talk about materialism, but materialism and physicalism have dominated science up until the current days. I think that's shifting. I think we're seeing a major leap starting to happen as part of this evolution of a new species, a spiritual leap, a cognitive leap, just a general leap in our worldview. But it's all very strongly, or at least it has been for the last 100 to 150 years, or maybe 200, been grounded in matter and in the ego as individuals. So really what's happening is we're going through a process of leaving home, and then we're going back home. So we're going home, we're coming home. And we have rounded the corner of this going home process. We are really, really close to start making the major leaps into more spiritual domains of existence. So why would you care about the material part? Why would you care about the scientific part if we've already discovered that we're perfect and we're all part of God, and we have, this much larger, greater, more powerful spiritual existence that's just, we have what I call spiritual schizophrenia, in that we have one foot in this world and one foot in the next. Why wouldn't we just want to skip over to the spiritual side and say good riddance to this part here in the material world? Why would we want to study cognitive development at all? Well, first of all, it's hard to think spiritually when we're stuck in the lower levels. So if you look at, this is Maslow. He's one of the people that preceded Graves. And I'm sure I brought this up because I'm sure almost everyone's seen the Maslow triangle, haven't you? I mean, that's pretty common. You can almost, it's difficult to avoid, but we start off in terms of human needs and survival, and then move on to safety and security, belonging, ego development, and self-actualization, and then eventually to transcendence. But so much of the world is still stuck in the bottom 4 categories, and that makes it very, very difficult that if we don't evolve cognitively beyond those 4 levels, then it makes it very, very difficult to think about spiritual issues. So even though spirituality is a much more important domain and a much more important topic, still cognitive development has a part to play in making it more available. And it's also because our brains are the transceivers, the transducers, the filter, and the interface between our spirit and the world. We create the world with our brains. And if you notice, if your brain dies, the world goes away. The spiritual world doesn't go away. When people have near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, they go to the spiritual world, and it's very clear and vivid and memorable and ecstatic. But typically that happens when the brain is dead. One of the things that we have observed is that the more spiritually, well, it's probably the wrong way to say it, but the higher level of vibration that people operate at from a spiritual perspective, the lower the level of vibration in the brain. So brain waves actually slow down when people go into deep states of meditation or deep states of ecstasy or spiritual connection. The brain waves slow. And so by turning the brain off, you're actually opening up the channels to not worry about the world and to reconnect with the spiritual side. And so we collectively create this consensual reality. All of us participate in it. It's not real. It's a dream. It is a fantasy. It doesn't exist. And yet here we are because we collectively create it. And so we not only collectively create it, but we only agree on the middle part. We only agree on the here and now. And it's your, the typical thing, if you ask 18 people who saw an automobile accident what they saw, you're going to get what? You get 18 different stories. And so we agree on the here and now. So we can say, okay, we have a table in front of us. There's a glass on the table. There's a glass of water. There are chairs around it. There are so-and-so people in the room. But the minute we start going back into the past to explain how it got that way, or going into the future to predict how things are going to be, that's where the disagreement and collectively created realities begin. And that's very important when we think about value systems and worldviews and cognitive models, because to those folks, even though we're collectively creating reality, those realities are just as true for them as yours are for you. So it's not solipsistic. It's not as though we have one great mind. Let's say it's Gloria. It's not just that Gloria has this one big brain and she's creating everything. And we just play bit parts in it. We're all at this level. I mean, we're all in the mind of God, but at this level, we're co-creating our entire reality. So I have a little exercise for you to do. And this is called Donut Crossing, and I'm going to tell you a story. So we're going to start off with Abby. And Abby is a very sweet, loving person. She's a little bit vain, but she's very, very nice. And Abby is deeply in love with her boyfriend, Clark. The only problem is Clark lives across the river. And the only way to get to Clark is to go over a bridge called Donut Crossing. And so this is a very dark and stormy night, and the water is up. It's near flood level, and it's very dangerous. And so she can't cross over to see Clark, but she really wants to see him. And so if she's going to get across, she can't use the bridge. So what does she do? Well, she knows that there are people who live on the shore who have boats. So she starts walking up and down the shore, asking different people if they will take her across in their boat. And first she comes across Bob. And Bob says, I don't want to get involved. Just leave me alone. So she's disappointed, but she goes on and she can't find anyone else until she runs into Sinbad. And Sinbad says, yes, I will take you across the river to see your boyfriend, but first you may spend the night with me. And she thinks about it and really ponders it. But when she thinks of how happy Clark will be to see her, she said, okay, I'll spend the night with you. And in the morning, Sinbad takes her across the river, and she goes to Clark's house, and he opens the door, and he's really, really glad to see her until he finds out about the night she spent with Sinbad, at which point he tells her, leave my doorstep, I never want to see you again. And when Blair, her sister, finds her crying and finds out what the story was, Blair goes and hits Clark in the face. Okay, that's the story. Now, what I want for you to do is from 1 to 5, 1 being the person you like the best, 5 being the person you like the least. Take just a couple of minutes to assign numbers to these folks, 1 through 5. And then we'll talk about it. Normally I'd have music playing in the background. I got to figure out how to do that on this.
Let's see. Cindy, please turn off your mic unless you want to speak.
Oh,
There's background noise. I'm not sure who it is, but I see that your mic is on. Just click on the microphone.
yeah, it's all.
Okay, so I want to start with Eric. Eric, who's the person you like the least among these people?
Am I just going off of what I know from The Simpsons?
Just go off what you know from the story.
Oh, I didn't hear the story. I was out of the room.
Oh, okay. Well, how about
Alright.
Kara?
A quick bathroom break.
So,
Yeah.
Kara, did you get to hear the story?
I got to hear part of it, but not all of it.
Okie doke. Well, I'm going to pick on Gloria then. Gloria.
Oh, geez. Okay. Okay. So Abby is nice, a little vain, but very nice. Clark is her boyfriend, lives across the river. Bob, so she has no way of getting across the river to see Clark. I'm repeating it because I'm not sure I have it all.
Okay.
Because I was distracted by background noise and trying to figure out who was making it. And Bob offers to take her across, but
No, Bob said he wouldn't do it. He didn't want to be involved.
Oh, he didn't want to do it.
Right.
Sinbad was the
yeah.
one who said, you have to sleep with me first.
You have to spend the night with me, and then I'll take you across.
Okay. And then what was Blair?
Well, once she gets across, Clark's excited to see her till he finds out about her night with Sinbad, and then he kicks her out. And when Blair sees her crying, she goes and hits Clark in the face.
Oh, Blair hits Clark in the face.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Who do you like best? Who do you like least?
I guess I like Abby the best.
Okay.
Maybe Blair second best.
Okay.
And then Clark. And then Bob.
Wait,
and
can I just clarify something?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So Abby did sleep with Sinbad,
Well, she spent the night with him.
but does that infer that they slept together?
I can't tell you.
Oh.
Just based on what you know about the story, how would you rank them?
Okay, I didn't like Abby that much. I thought she was kind of Well, I liked Blair and Sinbad.
Yeah.
Bob was kind of neutral, and Clark was my
Okay. Anybody have a different opinion of these folks? A different way of numbering them?
Not really.
Hey, Paul, can you hear me? This is Kathy.
I can, Kathy. Yes.
Yay. I like Blair.
Okay.
I like decision makers.
She took action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's probably my favorite too, now that I think about it.
So let me tell you a little bit more, but let me say at first, it's not unusual. I've run this particular exercise with thousands and thousands of people, and I've actually seen people come close to fist fighting over it when we get into large groups. You know, that people can get really emotional about how they rank these folks, and they certainly can disagree, either between person and person or between table and table if there are a lot of people there. So let me give you a little more information. Abby is a registered nurse, and Sinbad's mother was extremely ill, and he was afraid that she was going to die that night. Abby came along and asked for a ride. He said, please spend the night and help take care of my mother because she's so sick, I'm afraid she's going to die. And so then he takes her across the morning to see Clark, who is really excited to see Abby, but Clark is a terrible hypochondriac,
And when he finds out that Abby spent the night with Sinbad's mother, who was deathly ill, he told her to get away from him and to never see him again. And she went home crying, and that's when Blair went and punched Clark in the face. Now, would that change how you would rank these people? How come?
Maybe Sinbad's mother has coronavirus.
Has coronavirus.
Mhm.
But
In place, I wouldn't blame Clark.
but but why would it cause you to change how you rank them?
Oh, well, it would definitely cause me to change Sinbad because he's just protecting his mother. It's not for his own personal gain.
Right. So what you have now is you have what? More information.
Yeah.
More information.
And you have more information. And remember, our brains are transceivers, transducers, they're filters. They are, we operate on what information we can take in through our perception. And then our brain automatically fills in the gaps. And this is what helps to create worldviews. And this is why worldviews can be so different, not only just in their normal developmental levels of characteristic, but simply because different information gets through the perceptual barriers for different people. So we need to talk about the donut in our heads. We talked about the great grand cosmic donut and what's going on there, but we have a donut in our head as well. And the first thing that has to do with the donut in our head is the context in which it operates. When we take a look at how people behave and what developmental stages they use behaviorally, what we find is that it's very context dependent. And so when I was in the Southern Baptist Church as a kid, I remember the ministers complaining bitterly that all of their members were, or most of their members were different on Sunday than they were on Monday. In other words, they would behave a certain way on Sunday and they behave a different way on Saturday, and they behave a different way at work and maybe at home. And you see where I'm going. The context really helps to determine, how we operate cognitively within that world. And so, and context is very important because we want for our behavior and our beliefs and our worldview to be functional within those contexts. And the context can change. The next level, and this white circle that you're seeing with all the dots, that's our perceptual field. So that's what we see and hear and smell and taste and feel and intuit. And of course, in Eastern culture, they have a third eye because it sees the spiritual realities that are going on. But that's part of perception as well. So we have a perceptual barrier, and this is really what creates in this world. And remember, in this dream, it's the perceptual membrane that determines what information gets in. And
Paul,
yes,
this is Edna. I guess I'm always a little contrary or something, but
go ahead.
your portrayal of the donut it's a little bit like it's all in your head. But I'd like to give it another meaning or another thing. There, all these different people, they all have fields, so they create fields. So it's not something that our head has created alone. I think there's, sensing of what kind of field you're in.
Oh, yes. That's
Okay.
why I don't disagree. This is just a fun metaphor for me. I don't mean for you to take it seriously. It's a memory device. It's a mnemonic. So it's just there to kind of lighten things up and help people remember. But yeah, for sure. And even perceptually, our fields extend beyond our brain, and certainly psychically they extend beyond that. So of course you're right. I wouldn't disagree at all.
Okay.
All righty. So the next thing then is our worldview. Once we get beyond our field or our perceptions, we develop worldviews, and our worldviews help us to interpret the world that we're in and what's going on and then make decisions within that. So from our worldview, we make assumptions, and from assumptions, we make heuristics, and we all need assumptions and heuristics. Heuristics are just little rules of operation. So like we normally take a certain route to work every morning. If you commute to go to work, you normally take that route because your experience, your assumptions have been this is the most efficient route. My heuristic is
Okay, that's the way I'm going to take the route most days, unless the weather's bad or there's a traffic jam or something. And we have to do this, because if we were to try to think logically about every possible contingency and alternative and variable, you'd never get out of your driveway. It's just impossible to think of all of the potential ways of getting from where you are to work without spending an inordinate amount of time trying to do it, right? So we have these little rules, and we have rules for all kinds of things. I have rules for polishing my shoes, and I have rules for, you know, cutting the lawn, and I have rules for, you know, cleaning the house, and how I interact with other people. And it just, you know, 80% of the time, your assumptions and your heuristics are really good for you. They help you operate smoothly and easily. They're almost like social courtesies. They lubricate the interaction, and they lubricate our ability to get things done. So these are all necessary. So when do they become a problem? Well, and here they are. You look at the outside world that gets through your perceptions, creates a worldview, which then creates your assumptions and heuristics. So this is what I call the space-time complexity bubble. This, not the context, but the white dot, the white dotted line that indicates our perceptual field. That's really where we operate in terms of space and time and complexity. And we'll go into that in a little more detail later on. But this is just the bubble, and everybody's got a bubble. We all have bubbles that we operate in. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. They have different components to them. But each and every last one of them, at least in this dream, before we achieve cosmic consciousness, or, you know, fully attached to the Akashic field, or however you want to put it, we're operating out of a bubble that contains our perceptions, our worldview, assumptions, and heuristics. And they come in various sizes. So there are two key components to the space-time complexity bubble. There's our perception, and there's our influence. And these can get out of balance. So for example, if your perception is really large, and this can happen a lot in the spiritual community, and in other communities that are a little more highly developed, you get this really big perspective, and you can see all the things that need to be fixed or addressed, and you can see all of the potential changes that need to be made. But if the influence bubble is really small, then it just leaves a person feeling helpless and hopeless, and like there's nothing that they can do, and it causes despair and depression and sadness, and, you know, so because they feel like, well, I see all this stuff going on, but I myself don't feel as though there's any way that I can influence it. And we see it happening a lot in the political world. You know, people will say, well, yeah, a lot of stuff needs to change, but there's nothing I can do, so they just give up, or they duck and cover. On the opposite end of the scale, there are people who have huge influence bubbles. I mean, their influence goes at least worldwide, but their perceptual bubble is really, really tiny. And I could name a president, I'm not going to, but I could. And this is, you know, you see political figures all the time who do not understand that perceptually they have no clue as to how much they're affecting influentially. So the key here is, first of all, you know, do you have those bubbles of perception and influence in balance? Because they need to be in balance, but are they big enough for the context in which we operate? And again, that's why cognitive development is important, because cognitive development increases a space-time complexity domain, and eventually begins to, past a certain level, begins to affect spiritual development. So spiritual development helps cognitive development helps spiritual development, for no other reason. I mean, there are plenty of reasons, but for no other reason than expanding our space-time complexity bubble forces us to consider spiritual issues. Once it gets big enough, you can't just shove them out of the picture. They're right there in your face all the time. So when do we want to change? Well, when the context is not equal to our worldview. You know, if our worldview is too tiny and it no longer serves us or serves the world within the context in which we're operating, it's time to change. And so what we're really talking about here is the difference between homeostasis and epistemic closure, and those are scientific words, but epistemic closure just means closed-mindedness. Epistemology is how we learn and the method by which we learn. If we create epistemic closure, then we just live in an echo chamber. And how many times have you heard that phrase being repeated in the media? This is what creates the tribes. This is what creates the echo chambers. This is what creates the unwillingness to let information in that doesn't agree with what you already know or believe in. Whereas homeostasis is much more, and by the way, that's very synonymous with death. The minute you have epistemic closure, you might have physical death, but you can also have mind death. Your mind literally dies because you fail to take in any additional information. Whereas homeostasis, which is much more lifelike and indicative of life, that dotted line around our space-time complexity domain in a cell, that's where all the intelligence is. So the DNA, that's just a, you know, that's just a blueprint for making the organism. But the intelligence in the cell is at the very edge, and that cell is always checking the outside context and then balancing what it lets in and what it lets out in order to maintain homeostasis and lifelike conditions within the cell. And it's a constant process, it's dynamic, it's constantly in motion. And this is where we all need to be, given the issues that we're dealing with on the planet right now. We all need to be open to having homeostatic flexibility, having lifelike flexibility, rather than allowing ourselves to get closed down perceptually and in terms of how we take information. So we have to widen the aperture. We need to increase that space-time complexity domain. We need to increase the bandwidth and the spectrum in which we operate. And remember, brainwaves themselves slow down. Just because you have really high frequency brainwaves doesn't mean you're doing high frequency thinking. Sometimes the best thinking happens when the brainwaves slow way down into theta and sometimes into delta. And out-of-body experiences seem to evoke a gamma rhythm, which is entirely different. That's really fast. But we just don't know enough about that yet to be able to say anything definitive. But we can be definitive about the rest of this, and we need to open the doors of perception. So we're talking about leaps of development. And there are different levels here, and shoot, we are now, Gloria, we're now missing part of the slide. Can you guys see the whole slide?
I can, because I have the photos, or not the photos, but the images of the people. I have down to one, just one box, so I don't know.
So you can control that on your
just press the minus sign.
So if you need to clear up some space, you can turn people's pictures off.
And I don't know whether it's Edna or who it is, but somebody's got their mic on and it's making background noise. So if everyone would turn their mic off, unless they want to ask a question.
I'm doing it on my phone, which I've never done before, but it says tap to speak, and then I tap when I'm done. And so I don't think it's me. I was switching to get a message a while ago, but my phone, in a second, I'll touch done speaking.
No, actually, we can all see whose phones are muted and whose aren't in the screens. So it's very simple. Right now, Cindy and iPhone 2 are not muted, and obviously me for the moment. So you just click on your own screen, and then a mute button comes on the lower left-hand corner, and you just click.
Might be different on desktop.
Okay.
So here.
Thank you, Karen.
There.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, but we can see.
So what we have here are leaps of development, and when we talk about the Graves system, and I'll come back to Graves in a minute, we're talking about true jumps. And sometimes the jumps are bigger than others, but they're always a leap. They're always a jump. It's never just an incremental, slow, additive type of change. So, but leaps of development happen at many different levels. So the gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual, those are spiritual jumps.
I like to talk about it in terms of sleep, which is a little further down. So we start off in deep sleep. This is all true, also true in talking about God. Start off in deep sleep, then waking in the dream, and then being in the dream, and then waking up to the dream. This is where one of the great jumps happens, is just waking up and realizing, hey, this is a dream. Lucid dreaming, which now that we know it's a dream, we can do whatever we want within the dream. And so that can be kind of fun. And that's where we see people manifest in a lot of, healing and metaphysical and miraculous things happen, raising people from the dead, onto waking as the source, or waking as God. And in some circles, the belief is that once you wake as source, you eventually go back to deep sleep and go through the cycle again. In terms of the noosphere, or the Akashic field, or the collective consciousness of humanity, it goes Magos, Mythos, Theos, Logos, Holos, Cosmos, and Telos. Those seem to be the stages, and we're kind of pressed for time, so I'm not going to articulate those in depth. But these leaps happen at many different levels. So when we get down to the very bottom and you see all the donuts, those are the Graves systems. And I'll show them in colors because we'll be talking about spiral dynamics, but right now they're all pink. But we have 1 through 6, which is pretty much being in the dream. The leap from 6 to 7 is a big one. The leap from 6 to 7 is bigger than all of the leaps between 1 and 6. So it's very, very challenging. And then from 7, the leap to 8, people start to lucid dream, and then who knows how many different levels there are between that and waking as source. So are there any questions on that one?
So Paul, would 6 be the same as postmodern or orange?
6 is the same as green.
Oh, 6 is the same as green. So
Yeah.
7 is yellow.
Yellow, and 8 would be
Okay.
turquoise. And how do I get my thumbnails back?
One of the other, that's where you were,
Yeah.
one of those other symbols there.
Oh, I get them all in it. Okay, and then that stacks them.
Right.
Well, I have learned something new today. I feel like I'm on an episode of South Park. Okay. All right, so here's where we see that cognitive development and spiritual development affect each other. And it was really Ken Wilber who made this discovery, and that is, it seems that cognitive development and spiritual development happen independently of each other until you reach a certain point. So you can be highly developed cognitively and not have very much spiritual development at all, or vice versa. But past a certain point, and I think that's up around 7, 8, and 9, we find that the space-time complexity domain becomes so large that both cognitive and spiritual development have to take each other into consideration in moving on beyond that. And that's when you're starting to move beyond this world anyway. So it would be axiomatically that they would, but they do influence each other, and eventually they become the same thing. So there are lots of people who have interpreted Graves, and there are lots of people who preceded Graves. So Kagan, and well, maybe not Kagan, but Kohlberg, Piaget, Lowinger, Harry Stack Sullivan, Erickson, Maslow, Freud, Jung. I'm sure you're familiar with many of these. They were all stage theorists, and they all had stages that they saw people moving through in human development. Kohlberg looked at moral development. Of course, Piaget and Lowinger looked at the development of young people into early adulthood, and so on. Of course, Maslow looked at the needs hierarchy. But they all preceded Graves, and Graves gave them just this wonderful box to live in. You could take all those donuts and put them in the same box, and all of a sudden, they started to make sense. They started to layer on top of each other. And then Ken Wilber came along and did what I think was absolutely the best job of all of us, myself included, in terms of putting those all together into a comprehensive model that was understandable, albeit complex. It was understandable. And of course, Chris Cowan and Don Beck with the spiral dynamics, and all the other folks did as well, did a nice job. But the founder of the whole shebang was Clare Graves.
And Claire only wrote one book, and it's really, really hard to get. As a matter of fact, at one time, all of Claire Gray's material was locked up in a safe down in Denton, Texas, and nobody could get to it. So, but he wrote Levels of Human Existence. Chris Cowan went on to get it published again and did some commentary on it. But really, the Claire Grace material goes way back, and he was the pioneer. And as I said, he tested this all over the world. And what he would do is he would get groups of people together, and he'd have like 8 or 10 tables in a room. And he would tell these large groups of people, here's the problem I want you to solve. So it might have been world hunger, or it might be infrastructure, or it might be, you know, the coronavirus. He'd pick big problems. And he'd say, don't solve the problem, though, until you find other people that you would like to work with to solve this problem. And what happened was that regardless of ethnicity or culture or age or socioeconomic background or religion or any other factor, people would gather with like worldviews to solve these problems. And so what he saw was that this was the memetic code. This was the code of consciousness that people tend to develop through and that they congregate around when it comes to living life and solving problems. And it happened to lay very nicely right on top of all those other stage theorists that I talked to you before. I mean, you could just fit them all in at various levels to the Graves system. And so it was valid. It had wonderful convergent validity. And of course, Don Beck and Chris Cowan developed the spiral dynamics. This is what theirs looks like. So it starts off with beige and ends up around, in this model, around turquoise. And as you can see, they have their own names for it. This may not be the Don and Chris names. Different people use different names to describe the levels, but here's one example of spiral dynamics. Some people went on to use different words to describe each level, and they put it together in a double helix format. Others then decided to go in a more linear fashion, and they would divide it up into not only cognitive development, but moral development, epochs, and laid spiral dynamics on top of it. And you can see how we're talking now about cultural development, because we have the archaic, the magic, mythic, rational, postmodern, integral, mystical, and so on, which that sounds like Ken Wilber, so this might be Ken's, I'm not sure. There are other people who gave each level their own, you know, special nomenclature, although they all mean pretty much the same thing, and altered the colors a little bit. Ken Wilber now uses from infrared to ultraviolet and then on to white light for when we reach the level of reconnecting with God. Here's one talking about human evolution using Graves' model that also shows how many people are involved at each of the levels when they were testing for this. It's a pyramid. Here is Wilber. So you can say we have states of consciousness and states of cognitive development and social development, and he's using his own coloring system for that. It's also done in waves. I'm going to click through these pretty fast. This uses a little different descriptors for each of the color systems. Here's also Ken Wilber doing the larger model. As you can see, it gets kind of complex. Here's a very, very simple one that is used in organizations and with teams. It's kind of a corporate adaptation of Graves. This is what's called the integral spiral dynamics. And frankly, I'm not really sure that I understand what the difference is between the integral model and just the straight spiral dynamics model. I haven't studied it that closely, but I know there is a difference. And this is, you know, purely just a color coding, talking about altitudes of development, a different provider. And this was originally Don Beck's. So it wasn't in a, you know, it wasn't in a spiral at all. It was in a zigzag that went from top to bottom. And so I found this, and I think this is right. You know, Don and Dudley fought with each other, because they were both kind of the alpha males. I just kind of stepped aside and watched them fight. But they were always kind of arguing about how to describe the top levels of cognitive development. And here you say, and Don worked with Ken Wilber for quite a while, but he says, I reject all of this, Ken Wilber's assumption that mystics represent the highest stages of development and the integration of Aurobindo's third tier stages. It's yet another example of Wilber's attempting to exploit the Graves model in spiral dynamics. He lacks entirely the seventh code, the integral. He has no idea of how, when, or where each of the codes have emerged. I will gladly challenge him to a public debate, but he still hides out in his loft in Denver. The whole idea of tiers is unique language from our work, which he steals in order to market his. The man lacks any ethical basis. When he does so, he's nothing beyond red, orange. If he wants to develop his own system, then he should do so without exploiting my lifetime of work, which he continues to do, and so on, blah, blah, blah. So here's the deal. Most of the people at the top argue like this, and it's not very pleasant. They're pretty fierce about defending their territory. And what I've seen is that they'll collaborate for a while and then they'll split up. It's sort of like the Southern Baptist Church. You know, when I was a kid in the Southern Baptist Church, they would find a doctrinal difference. Instead of working it out, they would split into two churches. And I figured eventually the Southern Baptist Church would be a church of millions of single people, you know, each with their own church, because they could never agree on doctrine. But even though, you know, there's great argument about what constitutes the top levels, nobody argues about the lower ones. Everyone's in agreement about that. So you can take those to the bank, and I'll give you good rationale for why the top levels are the way that they are. Okay, so here they are, and I have them colored just as they would be in spiral dynamics, from beige to purple to red to blue to orange to green to yellow to turquoise. And at the very bottom, we have the reflexive level, and these are the reflexive level is very descriptive of newborn babies, for example. And in certain cases of autism, in certain cases of brain damage or degenerative brain diseases. And that is, these folks are just at the level of immediate gratification. They'll have a need, they immediately expect it to be gratified. It's what little children do. When they're hungry, they want to eat. When they're wet, when they're sleepy, they want to sleep. When they want to stay up, they want to stay up. So y'all seeing me okay?
Yeah.
I just got a message that the internet connection was unstable, so I just want to double check.
Oh, yeah,
so it's very reflexive. It's very, very, and these are my words. Other people use other words. And Gloria, I was wondering if we couldn't find a way to email everybody your taxonomy that you have on spiral dynamics that you sent to me. You remember that?
Yeah.
Where you talk about the different stages and when they emerged and
right.
all of that. I think that would be useful for folks to have.
Yeah, I have everyone's email.
So that's a reflexive level, and in human development, it's pretty much characteristic of the newborn. Then there's the tribalist level, and this is very, you see it in early tribes. Humanity went through this as a whole, as a developmental level. A great many of my extended family are Lakota. And so I have had the opportunity to become immersed in the tribalist value system, and it's fascinating. It's you know, they're very animistic, they're very connected to nature, everything has a spirit. They're very conscious of their relationship with the earth and with each other and with the creator. Very spiritual in that respect. The downside to tribalism, and you have to remember that each of these value systems emerges not only because the context has changed, but they emerge out of reaction from the value system they used to be in. So the rebel system 3 will eventually pop out of the tribalist system because they just get tired of, first of all, following all the totems and taboos and rules, tribal rules and authority figures, but also the idea that whatever is in the tribe is good, whatever is outside the tribe is bad, axiomatically. So the next level is the rebel level. You don't see much of this anymore, by the way. This is really indicative of a 13-year-old, and we all know how 13-year-olds behave. The third level value system, the red value system, is their primary goal is to have no constraints and have no rules or roles that they have to adhere to, and to have complete freedom of motion and freedom of expression and freedom to pursue whatever it is. It's kind of like the reflexive one in that it seeks immediate gratification, but it's in a much larger context. And you know, the classic, and each one of these, I need to point out, each one of these has a very bright side and then a shadow side, just as Jung would say. So the bright side of the rebel is, you know, the cowboy, the don't fence me in, and all the John Wayne movies and all of the Dirty Harry movies, and also when he played, who's that actor? You know, Make My Day. Clint Eastwood, right? The Clint Eastwood movies. Contemporary examples of this might be Rambo. You know, even that's not as contemporary, but but again, there are good aspects of it, and then there are shadow sides. Eventually, though, people get tired of rebelling, and eventually they need to move into a larger space-time complexity domain. So then they move into blue, which is the traditionalist. And America was in the traditionalist almost as a nation. We were in the traditionalist or the blue worldview because for a long time because of World War II. World War II had a very cohesive effect on America. It pulled everyone almost into that level floor, that blue mode of thinking where you know, it's salute and march, hierarchy is important. You always obey authority because they're looking out for you and they're going to do what's best for you. You know, the important thing is to do a great job, take pride in your work. You know, salute the flag and go to church on Sunday. And there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things, and we should be doing things the right way. And so that's the traditionalist, and it also has its shadow side. Eventually, though, when the traditionalists realize that doing everything the right way is still not going to get them rewarded in the way that they expect to be, that all of a sudden the company, it doesn't have a pension plan for you anymore. You get stuck with your own 401k and you get to manage it. Thank you very much. And you don't get, you know, all your vacation time accumulated, and you don't get to be promoted when you think you should be promoted. And, you know, they're not rewarding what you consider to be good behavior, and they're promoting other people that you think are shady and do things that are reprehensible. Then you move up into 5. So when following the rules doesn't pan out, typically that's when people start to pop up into 5. And 5 is the status seeker, the achiever, the person who wants to accomplish. And the bright side of that is that that's where a lot of Olympic athletes live. They strive for excellence. They challenge themselves every day. They provide examples. A lot of the great entrepreneurs are in the orange or the 5th level value system. And so they add a lot of contribution, but there's also, there is a dark side to that, a shadow side to that. I'm not going to talk about it much because that really deserves a long conversation, because we're just emerging from the dark side of 5, the dark side of orange. And I'm going to spend at least half a session just on that piece. So once striving for constant achievement and constant recognition, the 3 drivers for these folks are celebrity, money, and power. Once striving for celebrity, money, and power doesn't fill the hole that you have inside, people will move up into green or 6, and they become what we call the pluralist or the participative or the you know, and examples of this. I was a child of this worldview. I came of age in the 60s, and I was a hippie right along with all the rest of them. And I cared about social injustice. I cared about people having a voice. I thought that we should not discriminate,
that we should be diverse and inclusive and loving, and that we should embrace everyone and to work together synergistically to, you know, solve the world's problems, and that what the world needs now is love, sweet love. And that's what I believe. And that's typically what this value system believes. And we're seeing it reemerge in the millennials to a very, very large degree. And then we make that huge leap from 6 to 7, which is as big as from 1 to 6, where all of a sudden, from a cognitive perspective, we become systemic, synthesizing, integrated thinkers. And we start thinking in systems that are comprehensive and linked to each other. And I think one of the best examples, here's the distinction between 6 and 7. 6 was very well characterized by Occupy Wall Street. 7 is very well characterized by OAC and the New Green Deal, or the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is extremely well thought out, systematized, and integrated, whereas the Occupy Wall Street was anything but that. It's probably why they had difficulty with it. And then, of course, we eventually get to 8. People start arguing about whether this is a spiritual beginning of real spiritual development or not. But it's what I call the transcendent cosmic globalist, where we really do have one foot in this world, one foot in the next. And not just that, not just between this dream and the spiritual reality, but between this planet and the rest of the cosmos. So are there any questions about, we're going to articulate this in a lot more detail, but any questions about that so far? Okay, and by the way, just,
Paul?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, this is Kathy.
Hi,
Got
Kathy.
a question.
Question.
So I've been, there's been so much information here. I've been reading kind of the top line a lot. And a lot of the top lines have said transcendent. A lot of them have said holistic.
Yep.
And a lot of them have said integral.
Yeah.
And to me, transcendent versus holistic are different concepts. And
yes.
I wondered if you could
Yes.
clarify that. It's kind of like, you know, freedom versus determinism or something. Sorry.
Right. You know, and it depends. So here's the deal. When Dudley and I were writing the second book, which was mostly wrong, we were trying to describe 8 from the position of being 7. And I was not even fully into 7. And so part of it is when we try to talk about higher levels of development, it's almost always intuitively and not explicitly. So there are 2 ways of understanding these worldviews. One of them is an implicit way, where you kind of intuit what the next level or so is. But there's an explicit way, and that is, can you demonstrate it? And neither of us were demonstrating System 8, not by a long shot. And we just got it wrong. And so I think when you see differences like the difference between holistic and transcendent, that's a difference that's created by the point of view of the person who's writing about that level. It's at least one of the
Yeah, that makes sense. That really makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. By the way, I do think I have a foot in 8. I think I've gone through some fairly significant changes that are pushing me up into that system, but I clearly have 7 tendencies as well, and even 6. We tend to be smeared out, by the way. When we're talking about these worldviews, we don't get entrenched in just one and then suddenly move on to the next one, then suddenly move on to the next one in complete whole steps. It's more like an amoeba crawling across indentations on a metal plate. You know, these are centers of gravity. They have their own attractors, and we can get part of ourselves caught in one and then in another and then in another, and oftentimes we can be smeared out between 2, 3, sometimes even 4 systems, depending on what part of our lives we're talking about. So it's not stair step. It's not as clean as a stage development model would suggest. It's much more organic in that sense. Okay, So here are the primary attractors. So these are the centers of gravity for each one of these. Of course, one is gratification. Just give me what I want. Give me, give me, give me. The tribal system, the purple, is a very strong need to belong. Of course, red 3 is rebellion. Blue 4, the traditionalists, their highest attractor is certainty. They want to be able to be certain. And when that certainty is threatened, that's often when they move up into 5. The primary attractor for orange is winning. The primary attractor for 6 is healing. The primary attractor for 7 is breakthrough. And let me clarify that. Breakthrough, you know, these are also choice seekers. And they look for novelty and they love to try different things all the time. But the solutions that they seek have to have a win-win plus quality to them. In other words, they can't just be an incremental improvement to something. It means the whole system has to change to a much, much higher order of processing and function, or they're not interested. And they won't even stick around to help implement the new system that they figure out, because they're off looking at the next system, the next new system that's going to replace that. So, you know, people at yellow, they are bad implementers. They're great for new ideas. They're rotten at implementing. And of course, 8 is universal cosmic unity. It's the primary attractor for folks in that system, at least as far as I've observed so far. So this is a nested holarchy, and these are Ken Wilber's words, not mine. But each new level that we arrive at, it transcends the ones that became before, but it also includes them. So you can always go back and, I see a typo. You can always go back and take the best of whatever level you want and use it. It's not that it's no longer available to you, but you can also transcend it when you need to do that as well. Yummy. You get lots of donuts. So, as we were talking about, we tend to operate within 2 or more levels. Each has its own implicit and explicit components, and each is context dependent, and there is a central theme, however. So we tend to have a center of gravity, even though we may be smeared out across several different systems. And we tend to change in leaps, with leaps within leaps. And remember, each one of these has its own shadow. So there's a convergent, divergent component. You know, when you go from 1 to 3 to 5 to 7, those are all moving away from the group. 2, 4, 6, and 8, those are all moving toward the group. And so those repeat. And then we'll talk about operating styles later, but they repeat at every 4th level. And then there are repetitions at every 6th level. I must have missed that slide. So the important thing here is that even though it looks like a hierarchy, and in one sense it is, it's a developmental hierarchy, the same identities keep reemerging just at higher levels of space-time complexity. So for example, 7 is really 3 at a much higher level of space-time complexity. 6 is really 2 at a much higher level of space-time and complexity, which is why people who are in the green system have an extremely strong affinity and appreciation for people who are in the purple system. So you see lots of cooperation and collaboration between those groups. So we're talking about systems of thought and behavior. And what we have to remember, because this is really important, all systems are created to support the system. And because of that, the only thing any system will reward, whether you're talking about work or academia or politics or whatever, is normal. They will punish both failure and excellence, because failure and excellence threaten the system, and the system is set up to support the system. So when we try to make small changes, those usually regress to the mean. They get reabsorbed back into the system because the system is not set up to really make incremental changes. So if we want to take a system and truly move beyond it, we have to create a method whereby excellence in the old system becomes normality in the new, and normality in the old system becomes failure in the new. And this requires punctuated equilibrium.
And I don't know if we want to spend a lot of time on that, but just suffice it to say that when you're looking at how things evolve, a lot of the time it's not what you're told when people are preaching neo-Darwinist ideas, because things do not evolve just through gradual mutation and adaptation. Sometimes they evolve really quickly, really fast, just in a heartbeat. And this follows a very well-known mathematical formula. It's called the logistic map. And I won't spend any time on this other than to say, if you want to see a great film on this, go to this link, because it's absolutely one of the best videos. It's short, it's understandable, has wonderful graphics, and it shows you why this period doubling, this equation right here, applies so often to especially organic or lifelike systems, natural systems. Okay, so here's a logistic map, and we see these bifurcations. And what's going on is that, let me get my little cursor here, is that things will move along. You're in a system, and increases in time and energy and money or whatever you want to call that you're pumping into the system, get you better results, but then those results start to level out. And then what we see is if you continue to put more energy into the system, there's this wiggle, and then bang, it just pops into two different directions. One typically going down to lower levels of ordinary function, one going to higher. And this happens at several different levels. And when we get to the fourth, these are all bifurcations. When we get to the fourth bifurcation, and this will be important later, then the next step moves us into chaos. The chaos itself will eventually resolve into smaller versions of this diagram. So we start to see the whole system of bifurcations reemerging again. And in the value systems, this chaotic space here between the fourth jump, or after the fourth jump, is really that leap from 6 to 7. So if we turn them up on their sides, what we see is we get bowls of probability and their attractors, just like we were talking about with the various worldviews. And it's much like having a marble in a bowl. You know, when the marble's down at the center, you have equilibrium. And so things are kind of boring and things don't change much, but it's nice and stable and you have good stable equilibrium. But if you add energy to it, if you start moving that marble around in the bowl, whether the stimulus comes from the outside or whether it comes from the inside, then the marble becomes less stable and starts moving in a circle around the bowl. And if you put more energy in it, it moves up to the various sides of the bowl and then eventually gets up by the lip. And if you put any more energy in it at all, the marble jumps out of the bowl. And in terms of what we're looking at here, you jump from one stable bowl of probability into the next one, and it can go badly as well as in a good direction. So we have equilibrium, stability, normality in the middle, moves up to near to chaos, and after that, it's just pure chaos. And because all mutation, well, 80% of all mutations fail, it's better to direct your own evolution rather than to just leave it to chance. So going back to this idea of simplicity, now I've given you some complexity. Let's talk about simplicity. The reason these bowls are important and the reason the jumps between the worldviews are important is that every time we make a jump, we move to a new level of simplicity. So as you see here within the bowl, things are simple till we add more and more energy, and then they become really complex. And then we jump out of the bowl into a new bowl to a new level of simplicity, and on as it moves up. And the reason that that's important is that the problems that were really hard and complex and difficult to tackle within one bowl become extremely easy in the next one. We begin to see solutions that we go, wow, could have had a V8. Why didn't we see that solution before? Well, we were operating in the wrong system. There are, of course, people who want to return to the old days when things were simpler, before all of this current nonsense. You see that in the traditionalist or the blue value system all the time. They hate all this new stuff that's going on. But really, given that our context has changed, moving down to the old simple rather than the new simple would be disastrous. So if we make a jump, it's almost always precipitated by crisis that forces many important aspects of our life back to a more primitive and unpleasant state. So if we were to jump down for real, it would probably be because of nuclear holocaust or the coronavirus killing out a great deal of our population, or some disaster like that would have really dire consequences. So we don't want to go back to the old simple. So in addition to living near to chaos, which is what happens a lot when, like for right now, we're living in a state of very, very near to chaos. We're near that fourth bifurcation, and a lot of energy is being pumped into the system, and that can cause paranoia. And this is where the shadow side of our different worldviews can start to take over, because for some reason, I don't know why, but if being a good person doesn't work, we will try being a bad person within that system rather than making the necessary jump to the next level. That seems to be the easier thing to do. But a crisis can move us in either direction, and what we want is for whatever crisis there is to pop us up to the next level. So the jump from paranoia to metanoia is disturbing and frightening, but it's what we have to do. And we'll talk more about metanoia. I think you all know what paranoia is. We'll talk more about metanoia later. So some want to return to the safe old days when things were more comfortable, but those aren't available. So we need to get comfortable with the new process because it's part of the big leap. And I think this is where Kundalini comes in. Dorothy, I would think that the experience of Kundalini axiomatically moves us to another level. We can no longer contain that kind of experience in our old system, and we have to move forward to higher and higher levels of simplicity to be able to process it. So we have syntropy and entropy operating in our universe. Syntropy is the opposite of entropy. It's jumping to higher and higher orders of processing and function and integration. And syntropy is very lifelike. It's what life does. And eventually life will fill the universe. Entropy is not going to take over. Syntropy is going to take over. But we are right now, and I'm sure all of you can tell me all the different ways this is happening, socially, economically, politically, and environmentally. We have been making choices, especially politically and economically, for the worse. We've been allowing ourselves to slide down that entropic scale. But we're getting ready again for that fourth bifurcation. We're getting ready to jump into chaos. And here's our chance. Here's our opportunity. Just like with the coronavirus, we're seeing a move, even among those who oppose democratic socialism, we're seeing a move toward democratic socialism because now they're going to give everybody some money. Well, that's a socialist behavior coming from the people who hate the idea of socialism. So when the old people, it's that Joseph Schumpeter idea of creative destruction, sometimes the old system is so entrenched that it has to get torn down before something new can take its place. And I think we're going to see this happen in many, many different domains. So that's kind of it. So if you choose to hang in there with me, we're going to do more fun stuff. This was kind of an intellectual blast through the overview. But I'd like for you to start thinking of songs and people and movies and all of these things. Thinking of examples of these and the different worldviews. So what kind of songs would someone in the green level enjoy as opposed to what kind of songs would someone in level 5 enjoy? How do they handle time and space? What do they think about religion? What do they think about, one of the great ways to tell someone's value system is to look for bumper stickers. That will clue you in just a heartbeat. And Dudley and I used to take pictures of bumper stickers all the time because you could just run the gamut just by showing the various bumper stickers people had on their cars. And the other thing that I would recommend is that this is from a completely different author and researcher. It's Monica Bourgeot, and she wrote The Change Code, Practical Guide to Making a Difference in a Polarized World. And she uses the Graves model extensively throughout this. And she also mentions Don Beck and Ken Wilber. She doesn't mention me. I was heartbroken. But anyway, Anyway, it's a really good book, and I think would be a great way to augment what we're talking about here and to give you a little more depth into it in a way that you can absorb comfortably.
Paul,
So
you said you had written a book too, or do you have a book?
I've written 6. The first book was the one I talked about. That was Strategy of the Dolphin. You can actually get it on Amazon. I was surprised. It's in Kindle edition. They didn't ask me about it, but it's in Kindle edition. And the only downside is in the original book, we filled the margins up with these really great quotes, and all the quotes in the margins are gone. So it's just text and pictures, but it's still there. And at the time, we were looking for kind of universal metaphors for talking about the process of change. So Strategy of the Dolphin was about personal and organizational change. And so we landed on the dolphin, the shark, and the carp. And we use those to identify, various manifestations of the value systems. We articulate them in great length and inside the book. We do talk about Claire Graves and the different systems that he developed. And as I said, Code of the Monarch was about 60% wrong. We got some of it right, but we are way off the mark in other ways, and that was primarily my fault. So, I don't know that you necessarily need to pick that one up, but the Dolphin book would be a fun read in relation to this stuff. And it's pretty cheap, I think. The Kindle version is pretty cheap. And we were arrogant SOBs back then. So please bear with the authors who wrote it. I wasn't old enough to know any better. So we thought we had the world by the tail. And you know how that goes. You finally wake up in your 30s and you go, whoa, did I have that wrong? And then I woke up in my 40s and said I got it wrong. And I woke up in my 50s and I said I got it wrong. So I'm wondering what the next awakening is going to be, where I figure out that I got it all wrong. But anyway, it's pretty decent. It's well written. Dudley is a great writer. Yeah, that really is his strength, and the book's well written. And it's entertaining, and so it sold really well. It was a bestseller here in the United States and bestseller overseas. So it did okay. And then Singapore got it and photocopied about 50,000 of them and sold them, but we didn't get any revenue off it. And I thought Dudley was going to lose his mind. And I said, look, people are reading our book. What are you complaining about? They're reading it. So, hey, let's not worry about the money. I had to remind him that we were on a social mission. Anyhow, and he had at that time he had written 11 books. I don't know how many books he's written now. He's a prolific writer. So is any of this that we've talked about, is any of this of interest, or is it all just kind of filler that you'd put on the shelf and use later? Is there a certain direction that we should take it, or are you satisfied to let it evolve as it goes?
It went a little fast tonight. I'm busy scribbling things down. I almost feel like maybe going more slowly over the last parts of the things that you were talking about, the different levels.
That's fine, and we certainly can take it more slowly, and we can certainly, and the next parts will be more fun, I think, more experiential. I tried to get the overall theory kind of laid out, and even I found myself a bit breathless tonight, so I put too much in. That was my fault. When I do this next, I'll thin it out.
Well, I think the overview is really good, and I think your idea of using examples to illustrate what the different levels are, or I mean to demonstrate, not illustrate. But right. I think that'll be helpful. I mean, it'll make it kind of sink in. Like if we go slowly, and then at the same time look at how those are manifested. And I think that sounds like it would work.
Right. And, you know, in fact, all of you are already experts at this already. This is just new nomenclature. That's all. All of you intuit this and work with it on a daily basis. So once we start getting into things like music, what music would a level 3 rebel listen to? Well,
Rap.
you know, it used to be country western music, right? Way back in the day. But now it's probably a lot more of it is rap, and a lot more of it is, you know, so once we start getting into it, all of a sudden it becomes clearer, and hopefully will be a little more fun. And, you know, I don't know if I put bumper stickers on that list or not, but bumper stickers, you know, if you can take pictures of bumper stickers and read them to the group, I think that would be a great way to talk about it as well.
Yeah.
And plus, Gloria has this lovely little, what is it, about 5 or 6 pages where you cover.
Oh, yeah, I'll send it to anyone who wants to do the course. Is everyone aware that there are classes following this introduction that you can sign up for a 5-session course that will be on Wednesdays and Saturdays. The first one, I guess, this coming Wednesday.
Yeah, this was set up to be approximately 12 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see why we'll have a little more time to get into it and have fun with it and work with it.
And apply it. You know, I love the application of all these concepts.
And we'll talk about how do you go about the process of self-directed change, because up until a certain point, all of the change through these systems is environmentally directed. But eventually it becomes autocatalytic. In other words, we start to create our own changes. We start to create changes within ourselves, very much as like what happens with neuroplasticity, but more on a cognitive and a spiritual level. So it is possible to instigate change, big change, within ourselves, and also to do it culturally and with other people.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is very timely, and I have nothing but time right now. But maybe Gloria, remind us of some of the details of the course. So you said Wednesdays and Saturdays, and for how many weeks? What cost?
Well, there are five classes altogether, and let me make sure I have the right times here. Okay, so the first class will be this Wednesday, the 25th, from 6 to 8 p.m. Mountain Time. And then session 2 will be Saturday, the 28th, from 4 to 6. And then, let's see, let me just, session 3 will be, again, Wednesday, 6 to 8. That's April 1st. And then Saturday, session 4 will be Saturday the 4th from 4 to 6. And the last session will be on Saturday. We'll skip a Wednesday, and it goes to Saturday the 11th from 4 to 6. Okay? And we were going to have cookies on that one, but I don't know if we'll be able to gather or not at that point. I kind of doubt it, but we'll see.
It'd be kind of a shame if we had to have virtual cookies.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can sign up for it on our website, or click the flyer if you have the flyer. Click the registration on the flyer to do the course.
We are looking forward to it. I think
I am too.
So I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank all of you for participating. It's always gratifying, especially in times like this, to have the interest. So I really, really appreciate it, and especially given all the challenges most of you are likely facing, it's really nice. So, you know, maybe we can take this this forced isolation and turn it into something worthwhile.
Yeah, it's good to focus on something bigger than, you know, the details, all the details of this virus going around. And I mean, I'm very aware of what, you know, each development each day for the different parts of the country that I'm most interested in because of family and that kind of thing. But it's really nice to be able to focus on something a little bit more uplifting, more inspiring, more educational, more something that promotes the evolution of consciousness in all of us as we study the stages. One thing that I was thinking about this morning, as I was thinking about how to avoid the idea of, even though each one builds on the one before it, and there is kind of a developmental hierarchy for sure, and yet we have all those stages within us, as Ken Wilber says, transcend and include. And I was thinking, you know, you could give an analogy like baking a cake. You know, maybe the very basis is flour. That's the first step, right? And then the second step might be butter or salt and baking powder and sugar, and then butter and then eggs. And each one takes it a little farther towards being a cake. But you can't have a cake without every ingredient, right?
That's a good analogy.
Yeah. So anyway, so I love this model, and it's a lot of fun to play with, and I think one of the things I like about it is that it inspires compassion. Wouldn't you say, Paul?
I think so. It certainly inspires understanding, and understanding leads to compassion in my experience.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't take any energy at all to judge. Judging requires no understanding, but once you get to understanding, then the opportunity for compassion is much greater.
Well, just what you said tonight helps me understand why I often have trouble getting along with people, particularly in groups. And I think that's really useful to have some understanding of why people at different stages or whatever could have trouble.
Well, it's true. And what's what's fascinating to me, I don't know if you've ever read the book by Thomas Kuhn, Evolution of, what was the evolution of that? Evolution of Scientific, oh man, I'm losing the title. But anyway, he points out that
Paul, the structure of scientific revolutions.
Structure of scientific revolutions. Thank you, Kathy. One of the things he points out is that if an experimenter, and these are highly trained people, and they're supposed to control for bias, but oftentimes if an experimenter expects to see a certain result and they don't get that result, they will still see it. They'll see it anyway. They can be looking right at it and the result will be different than what they expected, but they'll still see the expected result, and that's what they report. Well, these worldviews are the same way. You know, sometimes when you present a different worldview with contradictory information, you know, sometimes we think that, well, if I just let them know what the facts are, well, they'll change their mind, right? But you show them the facts and they become even more entrenched in their worldview. Well, it's the same thing. We have our brains develop these kind of cow paths where our thoughts have a well-worn groove in the brain, and it as Morris Massey, he used to at CU Boulder,
used to say it takes a significant emotional event to move people out of their cognitive rut. And usually that emotional event was negative. Usually it meant, excuse me, well, you went to war, or you lost a child, or some other kind of tragedy happened. And part of why I like this theory is that there's alternatives to tragedy. We don't have to have a tragic event happen in order to develop enough, psychic energy for the shift to occur. There are positive ways to do that, and even loving and nurturing ways to do that. So I think that bodes well for those of us who are interested in being, autocatalytic, as it were, being self-changers.
Paul, I think that the example or what you said about seeing the expected result, even if that's not really what's there, is a good example of what the Course in Miracles says about how our perception is our projection.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't know how many of you are psychologists, but you know full well that a lot of the time we tend to just project what's going on internally onto the people around us, and then blame them. So yeah, the mind's ability to perceive what it wants to perceive is very, very powerful. And that can work in our favor, and it can work against us.
Well,
especially in Eric's case. I noticed that Eric has.
What am I projecting?
Not at all. I like Eric a lot. I've become very fond of Eric. Interactions in Course in Miracles. I really like your perspective, Eric, and I like who you are as a person, and I've kind of adopted you as a son who lives very far away. So,
appreciate it. Likewise.
So anyway, I like to tease you on occasion.
Give me hell, sure.
Well,
any other questions before we sign off?
I think that what we ought to do next time is at the end of the session have Dorothy read a poem that she thinks is appropriate for the occasion. I don't know if she heard me.
Yeah, I don't know if she heard you either. Dorothy? I don't know. Maybe she.
I think she's busy.
Yeah.
Anyway, again, thank you all very, very much. It's lovely having you here this evening, and you've certainly made my evening, even if I may not have made yours. So,
oh, you definitely.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate your being willing to present through Zoom so that we could all attend safely. And I love this topic, and I love your presentation of it. So I look forward to learning more.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
See you soon.
Y'all have a good one. I look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
I've been struggling to, I'm a poet and not a technical person. I've been struggling to unmute this thing.
I see.
I want to make one quick comment. Yeah, I'll come next time, because my worldview is one which goes well beyond everything that's been said here. I think this is fun. I think it's a great mind diversion. It's kind of for me, the video games of the mind. And I think it's fun to challenge use the mind. But my ultimate conclusion is you're never going to think your way to God. You simply are not going to do it. But there is another way to get there, which is not a mental way at all. Remember that Osho, that rascal guru, made a very intriguing statement, which I agree with. He said, the mind must drop before awakening can occur. Now, I
wouldn't disagree.
What?
I wouldn't disagree.
Yeah. And so I think this kind of discussion back and forth is fascinating. And it's fun. But there's something beyond fun. And that is the realization and the experience of what it is that you're looking for. Anyway, this was interesting. Thank you, Paul.
Oh, you're welcome, Dorothy.
This is
I would say that there are two very different levels of being, and one is which is what Dorothy is referring to, what I might call the absolute level, and the other, which includes the mind and the intellect, is the relative level. But the relative level needs to be refined to its highest, to the highest level that it can reach, which is certainly not, will never get to the absolute. The relative level, or the level of experience in incarnation, the experience of the mind, will never get us to that direct experience of the divine. But that doesn't mean we neglect it. We have to develop it also. We have to develop all of our faculties.
Right.
And this work helps us to develop.
Sorry. Here's the paradox, Gloria. You know, part of when I was talking about why do we even want to talk about this? Because as Dorothy says, there's this other level of existence that doesn't have anything to do with this.
But that's spiritual bypass.
Yeah, spiritual bypass. And so why would we care? And the paradox that I keep coming up against is that I will not experience, I think most of it, it's not to say that people don't, but I think most of us will not experience complete union with God until, or source, or whatever you want to call it, until we die, and die for real.
Right.
Because as long as we even have the thinnest thread, like in the out-of-body experience where you have that little silver thread, you know, that connects you, as long as there's even the thinnest thread there, we cannot fully embody in the next level because we're still anchored here somehow.
Yeah.
And so the question then becomes, well, if we're here, how can we bring that level to make things better here? In other words, how can we create a little more heaven on earth before we leave earth to go to heaven, so to speak?
Well,
how do we make it better here? But ultimately, of course, ultimately, we want to ascend to the highest level possible, and that means we're not here anymore. And this reality is just, you know, a transient dream, and that's that.
Well, we can have glimpses, we can have experiences, and then allow those experiences to inform our thinking and our behavior and our worldview here. You see, that's how we use that to make the world better.
I love that. Yeah, I think that we get our glimpses, our tastes. I love a phrase that Catherine Ann Porter uses. She talks, we can change in a twinkling of an eye. We can suddenly, everything that we've ever thought, ever assumed, ever believed in vanishes because we're in another way of experiencing. And she spoke of the moment that changes everything. And
yes.
That moment can occur, and we can suddenly be transported into another way of perceiving and seeing and knowing. And it does change everything.
It does change everything. And I think what it changes is the context of our experience, you know, in incarnation. While we still have to think about doing our taxes and staying safe from the virus and all these things, but still there's a context that it adds, another dimension that we always know is there. But we still have to do our work. If we have these glimpses and we think, okay, I don't have to do anything else now because I know that who I am doesn't really need any of this. Who I am is something completely transcendent. Well, then that's spiritual bypass. We still have to do both. We still have to do our work. We still have to resolve our negative patterns, and we still have to, you know, use those glimpses to help us in our journey to uplift the rest of us that doesn't remember who we are, right?
You know, Gloria, I'm sorry, Dorothy, go ahead.
I just say, I'm just agreeing with Gloria. It's very well articulated. I call it walking in the two worlds.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's right.
yes, exactly.
You have to be-
That's what
And
it is.
Ken Wilber, you know, he writes, I think he breathes books. I think he just exhales and a book appears. But he's written so many books and they all overlap to a certain degree. And so he's created a fairly complex model that takes a while to understand. But then he came up with this 4-step process that's the simplest thing I've ever heard of, and yet it embodies and encapsulates everything that we've been talking about, everything that you and Dorothy have been talking about. And that he says we need to wake up, we need to grow up, we need to clean up, and we need to show up.
I like that.
Okay.
So waking up is our spiritual development, growing up is our cognitive development, cleaning up is dealing with our emotional baggage and our history and our psychological issues, and showing up then is a matter of being willing to make a difference with all of that.
That's right.
And I love those 4 phrases because I think
I love that too.
yeah, it just captures everything.
Yeah.
Very nice. But once that awakening happens and the eyes, the veils really do fall, I mean, it does change everything, everything. And I use that phrase, walking in the two worlds. And I say, sometimes it's like you're 2 different people living in the same house. You never face to face. You communicate with little notes on the refrigerator. Because you're both those people. And, so it's very strange to suddenly be thrust into a world that you didn't know existed. But my bottom line is always anything can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. And you have no idea ahead of time what it's going to be. You have to not make it happen. You can prepare for it to happen. We should always prepare. But when it happens, you don't make it happen. You let it infuse, you allow it to happen. You open up enough to let it happen.
Yeah, you can't make it happen. It's like the Course in Miracles says, God takes the last step.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul. This is fun.
Well, thank you. Thank all of you. And I love your comments, Dorothy, as always. I consider Dorothy to be a mentor. I consider Gloria to be a mentor. So,
and I consider Paul to be a mentor.
Well, I had a friend who used to say, we must be teachers to one another.
Yes.
We must be teachers. We learn.
That's quite true.
Learn from each other.
That's how we support each other. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining in tonight. And hopefully we'll see you all next Wednesday. Okay.
Good. I'll look forward to it.
Take care. I'm going to.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, Paul.
Hey.
Thanks, Gloria.
Good night.